What happened when one small bad action changed everything and turn a family into enemies? And before we go any further, if you like emotional and real stories like this, please subscribe to Roots of Revenge, like this video, and leave a comment so more people can see stories like this because this story did not start with shouting or fighting. It started quietly inside a fancy hall where famous people were smiling and laughing while something painful was about to happen behind the scenes. And my daughter was standing near a mirror holding a brown envelope with shaking hands, because inside that envelope was her first real business contract, something she worked hard for without using family name or favors, and she whispered to me softly, "Mom, I think this is it. I think this changes my life." And I smiled at her and told her I was proud because I saw her struggle, her long nights, her self-doubt, and her courage to keep going when people told her she was only famous because of her parents. And while she was holding that envelope close to her chest, my brother's son was sitting across the room looking at his phone but watching her from the corner of his eye. And I did not notice it then, but later I understood that look was not friendly or curious. It was a quiet jealousy mixed with anger that he never learned how to control, because he always had everything easily and could not stand seeing someone else earn something real. And when my daughter stepped away for a moment to take a phone call, he stood up calmly, not in a rush, not nervous, just confident like someone who never thinks he will be stopped. And he walked over to the table, picked up her envelope, opened it, looked inside for a second, then walked toward the small decorative fireplace in the room and dropped the envelope into the fire. And I remember how my heart jumped when I saw the paper curl and turn black, how my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing, because no normal person would do something so cruel so easily. And when my daughter came back and smelled smoke, she asked with a confused voice, "What is burning?" And he turned to her with a small smile and said, "Oh, that. Your dad wanted to keep you poor anyway." And that sentence hit the room like a slap. And my daughter froze. Her face turned white, her lips started shaking, and she whispered, "What did you say?" And he laughed softly and said, "He never wanted you independent. He likes you needing him." And I felt something cold move inside me, because I knew this was not just a joke. This was a lie meant to hurt her deeply, to make her doubt her own father. And I stepped forward and said, "You do not joke about someone's future." And he shrugged and said, "She will get another one. It is not like she earned this." And my daughter finally spoke louder and said, "You do not get to say that." And he answered, "I just did." And people outside started noticing something was wrong. A staff member peeked inside, whispers started, phones slowly came out, and the calm, fancy feeling of the place started breaking. And in that moment, I understood that this was not only about a contract or a rude boy. This was about years of hidden anger finally coming out in the worst way. And my daughter was standing there trying not to cry, trying not to fall apart, trying to stay strong in front of someone who wanted to see her weak. And I held her hand and felt it shaking. And I knew this was the start of something much bigger, something that would change relationships, expose lies, and create wounds that would not heal easily. And even though the fire in the fireplace was small, what it started in that room was a fire that would spread through our family, our past, and our future, and nothing after that moment would ever feel the same again. The room did not explode into noise after that moment. Instead, it felt heavy and slow, like the air itself was holding its breath. And my daughter stood there staring at the fireplace where her future had just turned into ash. And I could see her trying to be strong, trying not to cry in front of people who did not deserve her tears, while my brother's son leaned back with his arms crossed like nothing important had happened. And that made something inside me burn even hotter, because cruelty mixed with comfort is one of the ugliest things in the world. And I looked at my brother expecting him to step in, to apologize, to say this was wrong, but he only sighed and said, "It was a joke. Everyone is too sensitive." And that sentence hurt almost as much as what his son had done, because it meant he was choosing comfort over truth. And my daughter finally said in a quiet but clear voice, "You destroyed my contract." And a woman nearby gasped and said, "Your what?" And my daughter repeated, "My signed business contract." And suddenly the mood changed, because this was no longer just feelings. This was money, work, and legality. And the boy's smile faded a little, and he said, "It was not important." And I said, "It was her life." and people started whispering, some shaking their heads, some looking uncomfortable, some already opening their phones to record, and a producer stepped inside asking if everything was okay, and my daughter said, "He burned my contract." And the producer looked at the fireplace, then at the boy, then at us, and you could see her trying to understand how something like this could happen at a formal event. And my husband walked in at that exact moment, drawn by the tension like a storm cloud pulling in air, and he looked at my daughter's face and knew something was wrong before anyone said anything, and he asked, "What happened?" And my daughter pointed with a shaking finger and said, "He burned my contract and said you wanted me poor." And my husband froze, not angry yet, just shocked, like someone who just heard a lie so big it felt unreal. And he looked at the boy and said calmly, "Did you say that?" And the boy shrugged and said, "I was joking." And my husband replied, "That is not a joke." And there was a long pause where everyone waited for someone to laugh or lighten the mood, but no one did. And my brother finally said, "Let's not make this bigger than it is." And that was the moment I realized they were more afraid of embarrassment than of hurting someone. And my daughter whispered, "This was my chance." And that broke something inside me because it was not about money. It was about being seen, being respected, being believed in. And someone had taken that from her for no reason except their own bitterness. And I saw tears finally fall from her eyes, and I hugged her and felt her cry into my shoulder. And the boy looked uncomfortable now. Not sorry, just uncomfortable that things were no longer easy, and people around us started choosing sides with their silence. Some stepping closer to us, some stepping back like they did not want to be involved. And the producer whispered that legal people might need to be called because a signed contract is not just paper. And that made the boy nervous, and he said, "It was just paper, she can print it again." And my daughter lifted her head and said, "You cannot print trust." And that line spread through the room like electricity. And someone quietly repeated it, and someone else nodded. And I realized this was no longer just our pain. People were feeling it, understanding it, and that scared the people who caused it, because truth has weight. And my brother suddenly looked worried, not about us, but about what others might think. And he said, "Let's take this somewhere private." And my husband said, "It already stopped being private when you let it happen." And the boy looked at the door like he wanted to leave. And I knew then that this was only the beginning. Because when someone hurts you and refuses to own it, the story does not end. It grows, it spreads, it demands answers. And as people whispered, recorded, and watched, I knew that what started as a quiet, cruel act was turning into something public, something serious, something that would follow all of us long after the smoke from that fire was gone. The tension did not fade after that. It followed us like a shadow as we moved into a quieter side room, and even there it felt like the walls were listening, like nothing said would stay private anymore. And my daughter sat on a couch, staring at her hands, while my husband stood near the window, trying to breathe through his anger. And my brother stood stiff with his arms crossed, and his son leaned against the wall, scrolling his phone again like he wanted to pretend none of this mattered. And that casualness made me feel sick, because it showed how little he understood the damage he had caused. And my husband finally spoke and said, "You do not get to lie about me to hurt my child." And the boy looked up and said, "I did not lie. Everyone knows you like control." And that sentence hit like another slap, because now he was not only cruel but bold, and my husband stepped closer and said quietly, "You do not know me." And the boy laughed and said, "I know enough." And my daughter suddenly stood up and said, "You do not know anything about me either." And her voice was shaking but strong, and that was the first time I saw him hesitate, because her strength did not fit his story of her being weak. And she said, "You always treated me like I was nothing, like I was just lucky. But I worked for that contract. I earned it." And he rolled his eyes and said, "Everyone works." And she answered, "Not everyone steals hope." And the room went quiet again, because that word hope was something no one could argue with. And my brother suddenly said, "We need to calm down." And my husband replied, "We needed to care sooner." And I could see years of unspoken tension rising to the surface, old jealousy, old comparisons, old family politics that had been hidden behind smiles and holidays and fake peace. And my brother's son suddenly said, "You all think you are better than me." And that was the first honest thing he said. And my daughter replied, "No, we think you are hurting." And that made him angry because pity felt worse than blame. And he snapped, "I am not hurting. I am tired of watching everyone praise you like you are special." And my daughter said, "I never asked for praise. I asked for respect." And his face twisted because respect is harder to steal than attention. And he said, "You had everything already." And she said, "I had pressure. I had doubt. I had fear of failing in front of everyone." And that was when I realized this was not really about money or contracts. It was about identity, about someone who felt invisible and someone who felt trapped. And instead of talking about it, one chose to destroy the other. And my husband said, "If you felt small, you did not need to make her smaller." And the boy shouted, "You never noticed me." And my brother looked shocked because he thought he had given his son everything. But maybe he never gave him understanding. And my daughter said softly, "I noticed you. You just never liked who you were next to me." And the boy turned away like he did not want to hear that truth. And my brother finally looked at his son not with anger, but with confusion and said, "Why did you do it?" And the boy whispered, "Because I wanted her to feel what I feel." And that sentence hung in the air like a confession. And my daughter sat down slowly because she finally understood that this was never about her failure. It was about his pain. And that did not excuse it, but it explained it. And my husband said, "Pain is not permission." And the boy nodded slowly like he knew that now. But knowing does not undo damage, and I felt sadness instead of anger, because families break when people refuse to heal. And as we sat there in that quiet room with all our truths exposed, I knew nothing could go back to the way it was. Because once you see someone's wounds and their cruelty, you cannot pretend anymore. And this was not an ending. It was a turning point that would decide whether this family would fall apart or finally face what it had been hiding for years. The days after that night moved fast and slow at the same time, because while our family was trying to sit with the damage and decide what it all meant, the outside world had already taken the story and turned it into something bigger. Clips from the gala spread online, whispers became posts, posts became headlines, and suddenly people everywhere were talking about burned contracts, family betrayal, and whether pain excuses cruelty. And my daughter watched it all with tired eyes because what felt deeply personal to her had become public discussion for strangers. And some people supported her, some attacked her, some argued about who was right and who was wrong, like it was a game. And that hurt in a new way because it showed how easily people forget. There are real hearts behind real stories. And my brother's son disappeared from social media for a while. And when he returned, his posts were different, quieter, less proud. And my brother called us one evening and said he was finally getting his son into therapy because he realized too late that giving someone everything is not the same as giving them what they need. And my daughter did not celebrate that. She only nodded quietly because healing does not feel like victory. It feels like relief mixed with sadness for what could have been. And the company who offered her the contract heard what happened and reached out again, offering to resend it and even publicly support her. And that moment made her cry, not because she won, but because someone saw her and believed her again. And she signed the new contract in her own room, not in a fancy hall, not in front of cameras, but in peace. And I watched her hands this time and they were steady. And my husband apologized to her for the lie that had been told about him even though it was not his fault, because parents carry responsibility even when they are innocent. And my daughter hugged him and said, "I never believed it." And that was when I saw the real damage was not what was burned, but what almost broke inside her. And over time, the family stopped pretending everything was fine. We stopped gathering just to smile for photos, and we started having honest conversations, uncomfortable ones, slow ones, the kind that hurt before they heal, and not everyone stayed. Some people walked away because they preferred peace that is fake over truth that is hard, and that was its own kind of loss, but also its own kind of freedom. And as months passed, the story faded from headlines, but not from memory. Because some moments change you even when the world forgets them. And my daughter grew quieter but stronger, more careful about who she trusted, but more confident in who she was. And I realized revenge was never really what this story was about. It was about choosing not to become what hurt you, and choosing to build instead of burn. And now I want to hear from you watching this. What do you think about what happened? Was it cruelty, pain, jealousy, or all of it together? And what would you have done in that situation? Share your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters here. And if you want more emotional, real, dramatic stories like this, subscribe to Roots of Revenge so you don't miss the next one. Because some stories are not just meant to be watched, they are meant to be felt, remembered, and talked about together.